Kakubin. Probably one of the most ubiquitous of all Japanese whiskies. This is a squat little bottle, for the most part. Cuboid shape embossed with a turtle style design and a big brown yellow label on it. It's a design that's pretty much been unchanged for almost 90 years. It's a design that they've had since basically the inception of this whiskey. And it represents one of the earliest efforts by Japanese whiskey makers to produce a product that would appeal to the tastes of the Japanese market, but at the same time, something that would also be able to compete with the mighty blending houses of the 20th century, which were Johnnie Walker, White Horse, Dewar's, Black and White, Bell's, Teachers. I mean, if you know your whiskey, you'll know that back in the day, they were big names. Many of them these days don't have the same prestige that they once had, but back in the day when this was first made, they were the big guys, and like that was what was that they were the ones that were dominant in the industry. And these days it's of course changed, where single malts have become the big in thing, but in the past single malts weren't really a thing, and most of the whiskies you could find were blended whiskies. And yeah, the Kakubin is just an effort to match them, but at the same time produce something that would fit a Japanese palate better. So how did this whiskey come into being? Well, if you know the history of Suntory, then you'll basically know the story, so feel free to skip on until later. I'll put the tasting time in the information box for this. But basically the story starts that this whiskey, the Kakubin, it was the brainchild of a man known as Shinjiro Tori. He was Suntory's larger-than-life founder, and this whiskey was the first commercially successful Japanese whiskey. Now, take note of that term, commercially successful, because we'll come back to that later. But this whiskey in particular played a huge role in turning Suntory into a household name in Japan, and eventually, after a couple of single malt releases, Suntory became world famous, and the rest is history. But this was a whiskey that made them a household name in Japan itself. This isn't a quality whiskey by any stretch of the imagination, just have to be clear there. It's something you can find in every single convenience store in Japan. You can find it across East Asia, across Southeast Asia to an extent too. It's pretty big in Asia and Eastern and Southeastern Asia in general. You won't really find this much in Europe or in North America, but there's other Suntory whiskies that are comparable. I believe Toki is an example, is something you might find over there, but not over here in Asia. So this whiskey, it was Suntory's big hit, and it found its footing in the post-war years of Japan. So at the time, you had lots of salarymen trying to make ends meet, and this one, the Kakubin, and its lesser cousins, Suntory's Tori whiskies, they were the whiskies that often those salarymen would turn to. And after they finish working, they go to a bar and just drink them. Not straight, of course, but they drink them as highballs. And that was how this whiskey became so popular. It found its calling as a highball whiskey, and as you can see on the box here, it does tell you that it is the original soda highball whiskey. So yeah, that's their claim. But anyway, I'm not here to discuss the claims on a box that you can find this whiskey in. But so anyway, let's circle back a little bit. So as I mentioned, this was the first successful Japanese whiskey, but it was not the first Japanese whiskey. I have to be very, very clear on that. Something came before this. This was very, very successful, but it was not the first one. As you know, there's the old expressions like, if you fail, try again. Well, that's what Suntory did. That's what Shinjiro Tori did. So, back in the early days of the company, Tori partnered up with a certain Masataka Taketsuru, who, if you know your Japanese whiskey lore, then you'll know that he was one of the founding fathers of Japanese whiskey. After he came back from studying in Scotland, he brought with him his Scottish wife, and he was supposed to work at a company, but that company, they had some issues with contracts, and basically Taketsuru found himself without a job. He came across Shinjiro Tori. Tori offered him a job. They went on to create the Yamazaki distillery together, and that was how that distillery in particular found us. That was the origin story. So they built the distillery. Tori built the Yamazaki distillery with Taketsuru's help, and they produced the very first ever Japanese domestic whiskey. It was not Kakubin. Just have to be clear there. It was not Kakubin. Its name was Shirofuda, and it was... It's a complicated story. So, go back to Kakubin for now. So, Kakubin was the first successful whiskey, but Shirofuda was the first whiskey. So I'm sure you can kind of guess what happened here. If it's a little bit confusing, don't worry. But basically, I'm sure you can guess what happened. So, the thing about Shirofuda is, well, it relates to Taketsuru in particular. Now, don't get me wrong, fantastic man, visionary. He could see far, far into the future when it came to whiskey. So he was a really great pioneer when it came to Japanese whiskey. He knew that if he played his game long enough, he would eventually change the tastes of the public, and whatever whiskey he produced would eventually become popular, which it did. But when he first came to Japan, he was a very ambitious young man. He had lots of hope, lots of desires, and he wanted to create a whiskey that was very similar to what you could find in Scotland, and in particular the region of Campbelltown, which was where he took most of his influences from. So if you know anything about Campbelltown whiskey, then you'll know that it's famous for being a very funky, malt heavy, sometimes slightly smoky, slightly dirty. It's a beast of a whiskey, and basically it's like your average night out in Glasgow, if you know what I mean. But yeah, I digress. Back on topic, the Shirofuda was a replica of the scotch that Taketsuru used to make and used to like drinking back in his wife's homeland. So I mean, it makes sense. He loved the place. He wanted to recreate his Scottish life as best as he could in Japan. He wanted to recreate the drinks that he liked, what he was taught. He was just doing what he was taught. So you can't think bad of the man there. But anyway, so this Shirofuda, it was an almost perfect replica of what you could find in Campbelltown at the time. And if he was selling it in Scotland, that would have been great. That would have been fantastic. If he was selling in England, that would have been fantastic. If he was selling it in America, that would have been fantastic. However, he was selling in Japan, which was a country that was very, very new to the whiskey scene. To put it nicely, it did not go down very well. It bombed, basically. And it was seen by the Japanese public of the time as a bit of an abomination. To put it very, very lightly, it was not to their tastes. And I mean, I can't blame them in a sense. They were not used to it. If you've ever been like 18 years old and you're trying whiskey or trying gin or trying rum for the first time, you'll know what I mean. When it hits you, you don't expect it, and you hate it at first. Eventually it grows on you though. And if we go on to the story of Taketsuru, which we'll cover at a later point, but eventually Japanese tastes, they matured, and Taketsuru's hopes of creating peaty whiskey in Japan, they panned out really well, and he had a successful distillery in the future. But going back to this one here. So, after the Shirofuda failed, it was a financial disaster for Suntory. They The whiskey flopped. They were in deep, deep trouble. They went to brewing beer for a while. The relationship between Taketsuru and Tori at frayed quite a lot, to the point that after Taketsuru's contract was finished, he parted ways with Shinjiro Tori and he went off to start his own distillery in the small town of Yoichi in Hokkaido. It became very, very famous later on, but that was his journey, and it was he saw it as his mission to convert people to the joys of peaty whiskey, basically, which I can understand. I can understand that. But anyway, Tori was left alone. So what he did was he went back to the drawing board. He tried and tried and tried again, and eventually he and his workers stumbled upon this one, the Kakubin. So they stumbled upon this blend and they just ran with it. They kept things simple, light, and most importantly, very, very, very inoffensive. Very inoffensive indeed. I mean, that's what they had to do. That's what they had to do at the time. It happens wherever a distillery opens in a new country. They've got to find the palate of the country it's operating in and adjust their expectations to that palate, and that's what Tori did. That's what Suntory did, and it worked out. Kakubin succeeded where Shirofuda failed, but that's enough history for now. We talked too much about history. It's 12 minutes already. So we came here for a tasting, right? And the tasting is what we'll do. So this whiskey itself, it comes in at 40%. So it's a 40% whiskey. If you can get to the camera, it's a golden color. I believe caramel color is added to this. I'm not sure, but I'd guess it's a mass market whiskey. Again, you find it in convenience stores across Japan, so it's fair enough to expect caramel color in it. But it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It doesn't matter too much. I don't have a big opinion on whether caramel color should be added or it should be not added to whiskey. It doesn't matter. But anyway, so let's smell this. So on the nose, one of the first things I get here is a creaminess. It's like very creamy vanilla, some brown sugar, malt, also some grain too, a little bit of corn. So some malted barley, some corn. I'm guessing the corn is coming from the grain whiskey component. I believe most of this is a grain whiskey, of course. It's pretty cheap in Japan. Not as cheap in the rest of Asia, but still, it prices around about the same price as Johnny Walker Black. Or between Johnny Walker Red and Johnny Walker Black, actually. So, at least that's what prices in Korea. I know in Japan it's dirt cheap. But anyway, enough about that. So, going back to the topic, you get some barley malt, you get some corn. Let's see, a little touch of granola, some honey. Honey's not strong. It's not a strong honey note, but it's a little bit there. Some oak. A little bit of alcohol. Even a little bit of mint, I'd say. A touch of mint. Interesting. So just clear my nose a little bit. Come back one more time. See if I get anything else. Yeah, a little bit. It's hard to explain this. I guess the maltiness is almost like a lager, if that makes any sense. I don't know. Like it's a whiskey, and here I'm saying that I can smell lager. I don't know, maybe my nose is just messed up, but that's what I get. Anyway, let's taste it. So there's a mild pepper spice, vanilla, a little bit of brown sugar, honey, I guess. Some green apple skins, not fresh, but more of a kind of bruised, a little bit aged, I guess, a little bit. I don't know what to say. I guess they're a little bit overripe. Cornflakes, definitely cornflakes. It's a little bit sweet too, so frosted cornflakes, I'd say, which sounds a bit strange, right? But yeah, frosted cornflakes, I guess. Yeah, I'm not surprised to get the corn notes because, as I said, most of this in the blend is probably most of what's in this blend here is probably corn, a corn-based whiskey, a corn-based blend. So grain whiskey. It might be from the Cheetah Distillery. And probably not very old, so it's very bright actually. It's quite bright and fresh in terms of the flavour it gives. On the end, there's some bitterness, and it might be from the tannins, but again, it could also be from the grain whiskey itself. Because often you find that young grain whiskey, it tends to have a little bit of a bitterness to the finish. Some of the lesser quality ones, it can be bitter the entire way through, which is not very pleasant. But you'll usually find that some young grain whiskies often have a bitter note on the end. Even if they're really well made, you still find that bitter note. I know. It could be that. It could be just the tannins from the wood, from the oak. But I say overall, it's pretty bittersweet. There's a lot of sweetness, especially as it gets close to the end, then the bitterness hits. But as I said, you get flavours like honey, like ripe green apple skins, frosty cornflakes. So all these are like notes are traditionally considered pretty sweet. But yeah, at the same time, you get some bitterness hit at the end. So yeah, I think bittersweet would probably be my best way of expressing how I feel about this. I don't mean like I actually feel like sad, as in like emotionally bittersweet, but yeah, just in terms of like the flavor profile it gives, it's bitter and it's sweet. It's bittersweet, fairly pleasant, fairly inoffensive. What is quite interesting though is, and I always find myself surprised whenever I try this because usually when I have a lower grade blendy whiskey, I don't mean something like a Compass Box, which is really well made. I mean something that is a little bit on the more mass market side. Like say, I won't name names, but you know what I mean. You know what I mean. What I often find is when I have those kind of cheaper blendy whiskies, I often find that I get a weird metallic note on them. It carries all the way through the palate, which is, I think, what I would say is a sort of bitter metallic note that you often get through it. You find it basically all the way through the whiskey. Depending on how well the whiskey's made, it can be pleasant, it can be unpleasant. But I often find that in a lot of blended whiskies because of the high percentage of grain whiskey used. But what I find with this one is it's not really there on the palate itself. It comes through a little bit at the end, but they hide it pretty well overall, I'd say. It's not really something you really find on this whiskey, at least not until the end. So I'd say it's blended really well. They know what they're doing. It's not a terribly complex whiskey. Don't go into this expecting it to be like a masterpiece. It's not complex. It's very inoffensive. It's something that basically anybody can enjoy, and that was really the whole purpose behind its existence. It was supposed to be a whiskey that anyone could just enjoy. And in my own honest opinion, this whiskey, it shines best as a highball. That's what it was originally made for. That's how it was originally enjoyed. And honestly, that's It's, yeah, get my little glass here. That's its purpose, I guess. It's very much a whiskey that you want to put in highballs. You can drink it neat. It's perfectly fine to drink neat. Some people don't like it. Some people might find it doesn't taste, it's not to their taste neat. Some people might find it like it, but that's okay. Everybody's different. Everybody's got different tastes. But it definitely excels as a highball whiskey. Especially over some nice cold ice and a little dash of lemon on top. Really good. It's really good that way. One last sip. Yeah, it's a good whiskey overall. As I said, I much prefer it in a highball. Drink it neat if I need to, but it's far better when it's highballed. So anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and I really enjoyed making this episode. It was really fun getting deep into the history and lore of this spirit in particular. So thanks again, and have a good one.